taking attendance. We're not taking attendance to keep track of who's here or not here, but it helps us very much to make sure that our mailing list is correct and also to be able to report on attendance at our seminars. And it also helps us when we think about future guests to invite to our seminars to know what the attendance was. So please sign up to that link. It's really easy to do. Also, often after seminars, we have pro seminars for particularly for graduate students who want to meet with the speaker. But Cecilia Menhivar is here on campus. She's a sociology faculty member, if you don't know her, and she's kindly said that she's happy to talk with people who want to talk with her directly. Just send her an email message, and you can find a time to get together and talk, or not get together, but get together virtually and talk. Um, so, and also in terms of ground rules, Cecilia requests that you hold longer questions, but if they're questions of clarification, either interrupt or put them in chat and I'll ask them of her, but then hold longer, questions if it's not clarification to the end, if you would. So, okay, without further ado, let me introduce Cecilia Menhivar, who's a professor in sociology, who is currently in Arizona, but has fortunately joined us for the past couple of years in Los Angeles, and she's going to be talking about in-depth qualitative interviews. So a topic that she knows a lot about. So Cecilia?
Thank you, Anne, so much for the opportunity to share what I know about in-depth qualitative interviews with the members of CCPR and affiliates and everyone else. So thank you so much for the opportunity. I am going to give you sort of like an overview. So many of you, I'm sure, already know a lot of what I'm going to say. A lot of it is applied, of course, to my work on immigrant communities and my work on women and violence. So some of the things I'm going to say are going to be general about in-depth qualitative interviews. Other will be immigration specific, but even the immigration specific, the points that I'm going to make apply broadly to how we do qualitative interviews. So first, I just want to give you a very, very quick one slide of the different projects I've worked on in which I have used in-depth qualitative interviews. In my first project in San Francisco, I examined immigrant social networks. In Guatemala, a project that I work for Ann Pebbley in Guatemala. I used it on women, social ties and violence in two semi-rural towns there. In Los Angeles, among Guatemalan women and their social networks as these relate to health-seeking behaviors. In Phoenix, on the effects of immigration enforcement, immigration laws, and later immigration enforcement among Salvadorian, Guatemalans, and Hondurans here in Phoenix. Religion and the church among Salvadorians in Washington, D.C., and the latest one, my ongoing ethnographic work on relations between established communities and between newcomer immigrants and established residents in a rural town in Kansas. In all these projects, I have used in-depth interviews in conjunction with ethnographic observations. But today I'm going to separate what is in-depth interviews aside from how I use ethnographic methods in my work. And I mentioned this so that any questions, for any reason anyone wants to refer back to what I have done, excuse me, we can do that. So first, very briefly, the main advantages of in-depth interviews, of course, if, as with any other method, the research question, of course, determines what is the best method to collect data to address the question. That should go without saying. But just to remind people what in-depth interviews are good for. They offer study participants the opportunity to share their views in their own words, the way they see their worlds. And they offer researchers the opportunity to see how participants see their worlds, interpret their worlds, and see the reality around them, and the meanings they attach to their to what happens in their lives. So in-depth interviews really place study participants at the center of the study. They ensure rich new understandings that come from switching the lens from really the researcher who takes the center in some other methodologies to the researched, to the study participants who really guide the conversation and guide the course of the interview. And so what happens is that in the process of the interview, the process itself allows for new questions to emerge, questions that may redirect the focus of the study. So I will go over specifically how this happens. And so, for instance, I'm going to give you a few examples as I go along. In my work, this has been key for capturing what specific contexts where immigrants live, or where women in Guatemala, for instance, lived, and how they see, how they make sense of the world. And this has allowed me to, quote unquote, discover in aspects of their lives that might not have been visible to me, or might not have been known to me if I had not conversed with them with attention. So, and also it has allowed me to see how lives of people vary across contexts and times as well. So in-depth interviews don't happen in a social vacuum. And so the first part of my presentation, I'm going to go over the in-depth interview itself. And later on, I will talk about the context within which one conducts in-depth interviews, because the two are very much related. So how do in-depth interviews achieve all this richness and all these moments of discovery, all these moments, critical moments where a study can even change focus and direction? There are four main aspects of in-depth interviews. They're all interconnected, but I'm going to try to separate them in different slides here so that I can give attention to each. Those are careful questioning. Of course, when we do research using other methodologies, we know that we have to write careful questions. But I'm going to explain how that applies to in-depth interviewing in a moment. Attentive listening is absolutely key when one is doing in-depth interviews. Sensitive probing, not just probing, but I'm going to explain why I emphasize the sensitive part of probing, and deliberate flexibility on the part of the researcher to pay attention to what the study participants are telling you, so that you can adjust to that. So I will cover each of these as I move along. Careful questioning. What do I mean by careful questioning? The questions that are included in an in-depth interview, of course, we are all informed by the literature, the scholarship in the area in which we're working. So we have to pay attention to that. But in addition to that, in-depth interviews have to include informed initial questions that will will match, of course, the characteristics of the people in the study, their experiences, the context in which you're doing the work, and the time, historical moment, the time, the political time when you're doing this work. And this, of course, is very relevant to my work on immigration because I have to pay attention to context. Doing interviews in rural Kansas is different than doing in-depth interviews in Phoenix or in Los Angeles or in San Francisco or in DC. Context and the initial, I say initial questions because I will talk about the flexibility that I mentioned earlier, how questions will be adjusted as the study goes along. So initial questions have to be informed by the standard literature, but also by a good knowledge of the study participants' lives in the place where they live at the time when they're living. This also includes paying attention to who exactly one needs to talk to. Very often we make assumptions about who the best person to talk to may be, but in the course of the study, we may discover that there are other people we need to talk to as well. So my recommendation is to spend some time, at least in the context where participants live and interact, that is relevant to the study's goals. So not just hang out, but spend time in the as close as possible to the context that is relevant for the study's goals. If you're doing research on health, you want to spend time in relevant places. If you're doing research on families, you want to spend time broadly in a context where you can see how families interact, or education. So not just spend time in general, but spend time with intention, with a focus on what is relevant for the project. In my case, with my ethnographic work, this is natural because I have to spend time, months actually in my case, before I even start talking with people informally in the places where I've done the work. But that's not what I'm talking about here. For instance, so going back to the careful questioning and how this might evolve in the course of the interviews. In my study in San Francisco on social networks among the Salvadoran community there, I started with the assumption that immigrants always rely on their informal networks for assistance and for what they need when they arrive in a new place, because that's what the literature told me. However, I remember distinctly after the 5th interview, out of 50 that I did, I was not hearing that. The answers that I was getting did not match what the literature told me. So this was my dissertation project at the time, and so I consulted with my committee members, and they advised that I needed to actually include questions that would capture these other aspects of networks, tension, weakness in networks, that would allow me to more closely capture the what networks look like in that community. So I had to, in the middle of the as I started the project, I had to adjust to add other questions that would allow me to capture that aspect that I had not thought about before. In rural Kansas, something similar happened. We had not realized, and I said we because I'm doing, this ethnography is a team ethnography with 2 graduate students, and we had not realized what the housing conditions were like until we got to the field and spent the first several months and discovered that the immigrants in that community happened to be Guatemalan Mayan immigrants, that they all lived in trailer parks with specific housing conditions that then we started to ask about. In Los Angeles, the work that I did with Guatemalan immigrant women and how they mobilized their informal ties to access medications and informal healthcare. I had to, after spending time and doing the first interviews, I realized that I needed to ask more specific questions about the kinds of illnesses and what they did and who they went to be able to capture that aspect of how they mobilized their ties for the purposes of accessing healthcare, informal healthcare and medications. So careful questioning, of course, requires certain questions that must go really in in-depth interviews. There are starter questions that set the tone for the interview. These are very important because if you don't have the right starter questions, the whole thing can just fall apart. Depending on the topic of the study of the interview, some starter questions could be the general demographic profile questions, which you should include actually as close-ended questions because then it makes it easier for coding later. Or you can start with questions about how people are feeling. Depending on the study, the starter questions will vary. The core, of course, of in-depth interviews are open-ended questions. But as I just mentioned, you should also include some close-ended questions, especially demographic profile questions that will make it easier for analysis later when you need to differentiate the study participant group by gender or age or whatever, however you're cutting the analysis. Some examples of open-ended questions, and I think these are across the board, some of the more common ones, the when, how, why questions, for instance, in the work that I've done. When did you migrate here? Captures the history, the story of migration. Why did you come here? Who else migrated with you? Who remained in the home country? How did you come here? What do you do? How do you feel? What do you think of your life now? These questions may sound general and not very specific and narrow enough, but they do lead to the conversations that will generate very rich data. Of course, for each topic of the interview itself, you would want you want to ask similar open-ended questions. I'm just giving you an example of the migration story. What this does, asking questions this way, is also something very critical. It allows you to create a timeline of events. You can think of, for instance, an illness. You can think of any life event you want to capture, but it allows you to create a timeline that is very crucial, because you can then see what happened before and after migration, for instance, an illness, the birth of a child, a new job, whatever you're trying to do with your in-depth interviews. And that is another rich aspect of in-depth interviewing, that it allows you to create that, trace that, so that you can see in the analysis what happened before and after. Attentive listening and active listening, that of course goes hand in hand with what I just said. And it is actually fundamental to in-depth interviewing. In fact, it's probably the most important skill to have and to cultivate as you conduct in-depth interviews, because paying attention to what people are telling you will provide cues for you to follow and to generate additional questions, I will move next slide into probing, to probe, to even change the direction of the study itself, to change focus, to see maybe how gender or how other family members or how something that you had not thought about actually plays a key role. So active listening is quite key in in-depth interviewing. For instance, it allows you to see if there are any contradictions, because in an hour or two long interview, you will have maybe different aspects of a story. Sometimes people contradict. We all contradict ourselves if we are going to talk about about something for 2 hours. So it allows for the researcher not to catch lies, because that's not the point here, but it allows the researcher to see why someone might have thought that it was necessary for them to portray themselves in a particular way, and then provide an explanation or provide context or provide further information about that seems contradictory. So it allows to uncover maybe pressures people have, how things are constructed, how things are experienced. That leads people to sometimes present different aspects or partial aspects of the story they're telling you. So this active listening and creates a sense of a conversation more than just questions being asked. One thing that I have noticed is that very often during these conversations, study participants speak in general statements, sometimes provide an example of someone else. But if you pay attention closely, they are actually talking about themselves. And so you really have to make sure that you're not going to tell the person you're talking about yourself, but you have to be careful about why is this person telling you indirectly their own stories. And this is something that, of course, one comes from paying really close attention to what they're telling you. I have an example about this from a woman I interviewed in a rural town in Guatemala. She came from a well-to-do family, and at first she gave me a story about. She explained in detail how her marriage, her wedding had taken place, and um, how that happened. And then later on, I realized that she had never been married, actually. But what happened is that her social position in that town um, created such pressure for her to perform, to tell me that, um, to tell me something that she thought I had expected to hear. And so, but it was my job to um, to put these two together, making after I I discovered this as she was telling me the rest of the story. So active listening is actually quite fundamental in conducting an in-depth interview. And sensitive probing goes hand in hand, of course, with active listening. And I emphasize sensitive for a few reasons. So probing in qualitative interviewing is, again, I'm separating it into slides here, but they actually go together hand in hand. When during an in-depth interview, you come across something unexpected, um, that is a cue for you to ask clarification questions, to ask further questions, to ask, so what happened then? How did that happen? How did you feel? What did you do? So it offers the study participants an opportunity to explain something that is important for them. And for the researcher to demonstrate empathy and interest, but also to to present a more human side of the whole research enterprise. It's a more engaging way to converse in the context of an in-depth interview. I emphasize sensitive because probing requires calibration between wanting to know more, but at the same time not being pushy, not demanding more. It's body language is very important in determining when people want to continue giving you information and when they don't, when they want to stop. So yes, you do want to show interest. Yes, you want to, of course, genuinely, you're interested and you want to know more. But at the same time, excuse me, you don't want to push too much because the interview can actually end right there. So it requires paying attention to body language and other cues, to be very sensitive to where people where people will allow you to go in this conversation. And the fourth aspect is deliberate flexibility. So keep an open mind during the interview process, alert to what your study participants might be bringing up to your attention, and so follow their lead. And this requires flexibility on your part. Openness to new information, new angles. I remember when in that study in San Francisco, the study participants started to tell me that they couldn't really count on their families for support because they had an altercation and they couldn't really count on them. At first, I didn't know what to do with this information that then require me to adapt and to add questions and to start paying attention to that aspect of their lives. Another example that I had not expected that came up in that same study was the many times immigrants mentioned church and religion in their lives. And this was a time when the immigration scholarship had already dropped really the subject of religion, because we were supposed to be secular and we were not supposed to have much that was not supposed to play a central role in people's lives anymore. All of a sudden, I am faced with these mentions of church. I even, in the context of my ethnographic work, I accompanied the study participants to different programs at church, and so I did not know again what to do with this information, and because it was new to me. Again, I followed their lead and I ended up including that, and that actually became another area of interest for me that I pursued in a different project in Washington. But again, it's an example of being flexible to pay attention to what people tell you that is important in their lives. It's very simple, but it is actually what leads to these moments of discovery, these moments of finding something really new through spending time and conversing with people in their lives. So the interview context, the setting, the interviewer, technical aspects. The setting, of course, where interviews are conducted matters quite a bit. The interview's positionality, we know from research, matters also, but I will say one thing about that. How many interviews to conduct, the length of the interviews, and access to study participants. So this is sort of like what surrounds the interview that I just covered. The interview setting, of course, this is again quite key. Where this conversation happens is shapes the conversation you're having, the interview you're having. It affects what is being said, how it's being said, where the interview takes place. I have conducted interviews in people's homes, but not just in their homes. If there are people around and the study participant does not feel comfortable being with other people in the home, we move to a kitchen or even to a bedroom, depending on what is where they feel comfortable. I have done interviews in parking lots. I have done interviews in parks, outside people's places of work. But the setting, that place where the interview takes place, you have to keep in mind that it will affect the conversation, the interview content itself. Who else is present, of course, matters just as much. Children, partners, other family members. I have many interviews where I have interviewed people where inadvertently other people are present, and then I interview the same person individually, and the interviews are quite different. This is interviewing couples separately or together, and again, there's research on this. Who else is present in the interview? Sometimes the goal of the study, the point of the study is precisely to talk to people when others are present. But that's something that that you have to just be aware of if that is not the goal of the interview. Face-to-face interviews, of course, are preferred. Individual interviews are preferred. But during the pandemic, we have discovered that there are many other ways to conduct interviews when face-to-face is not possible. So Zoom interviews, people have been doing Zoom interviews, Skype interviews. I wouldn't recommend telephone interviews for in-depth interviews because you lose the body language, facial expressions that are so important to take into account during an in-depth interview. So, but just keep in mind that I think the moment we're living has left us, has opened up quite a bit of creativity in how we do the work, and so people are using these other ways of conducting interviews. The point here of all this is that you again take the lead of the study participant and conduct the in-depth interview where they will feel most comfortable talking openly and sharing whatever they want to share with you. Just that. So I always ask where they want to talk, and they tell me where. Interviewer's positionality. Does matching the interviewer's social position to the characteristics of the study participants matter? Yes, it does, of course. There's research on this, and I agree with it. But what aspects of what characteristics actually matter more? I guess depends on the study, but also, for instance, we know that people have tried to match according to race, ethnicity, gender. Those are the more common ones. In fact, I kind of tried to do that. It happened naturally for me that I ended up matching myself with the study participants according to gender and race, ethnicity. But an important one is also language ability, national origin, and social class. I mention this because in the context of in-depth interviews with immigrant populations in the United States, for instance, immigrants from Latin America, yes, people speak Spanish, but the Spanish accents and vary quite a bit across the continent. And of course, we have a significant indigenous population from southern Mexico and Guatemala, for instance, who may not even be fluent in Spanish. And so one has to be attentive to what aspects of matching you want to take care of. Something that that comes up sometimes is whether a friendly, talkative interviewer works better. I think it's that's not that wouldn't it doesn't necessarily work better. What works best is to conduct interviews by someone who's genuinely interested, sensitive to the study participants, and who may not match perfectly the other characteristics, the other social positions, but who has a genuine interest in the lives of the people who are in the study. How many interviews? We're talking about small numbers here, of course. And the number of interviews will depend on the information you are gathering as you conduct the interviews. Because a rule of thumb in in-depth interviewing is that you stop once you achieve saturation, meaning when additional interviews do not generate additional new knowledge. So once you start getting the same story, you have kind of achieved saturation and you can stop. This usually happens at around 60, 50, 60, 80 interviews. Under 100 is fine. You do want, these are small numbers, but you do want um, a good enough number, maybe 60 to 80, so that you have variation within the study participant group for analysis later. You do want, of course, if you want target, if gender is a key aspect of the research, of course, you want to achieve a good number of people of different genders to be able to analyze by gender, or the same thing by race and ethnicity, or whatever analytical interest you have. But the balance between achieving saturation and having enough people to be able to conduct rich analysis is something to consider. Length of interviews between 1 and 2 hours is good. It generates very good information. Over 2 hours, I would recommend to maybe split it into 2 sessions, because it's really tiresome to talk more than 2 hours about, even if you're so interested and you're so dedicated, it's very exhausting for the study participant and for the person who does the interview. Life histories are wonderful because it provides a rich history of someone's life. It's very it provides the most information about someone's life, but that's not always possible or necessary, depending on the research question, the goal of the study. More focused interviews can also include a sense of a timeline that is so important for the analysis later, and these will, of course, tend to be shorter. And this is the last slide that I have, access to study participants and what we call entry. Snowball seems to be quite common in conducting in-depth interviews because it provides a good way to access study participants on the recommendation of other study participants. It is fine. I've actually not used snowball sampling. I have used a modification of it. I'll just tell you in a moment. Because snowball sampling tends to produce a very homogeneous groups of study participants, people who are connected with each other, birds of a feather kind of thing. It will produce a homogeneous group. And the same thing with doing all the interviews with people at one site, one research site, whether that is a place of work or a clinic or a church. So think about where and how you're accessing people. What I have done is I start with what I called, I think other people might use similar terminology, multiple points of entry, so that I increase the heterogeneity of my study participants. I contact people through ESL classes, for instance, immigrants in the United States, through places of employment, through churches, parks, sports events, so that I have, I'm not trying to achieve representativeness here. What I'm trying to do is covering a broader set of experiences in this immigrant community, and that I'm not going to be able to tap into if I only access people through one of these points of entry, and then snowball. I have used a little bit of snowball sampling after I use my multiple points of entry, 5 or 6 multiple points of entry, and then I can get a referral for maybe to 1 or 2 more people. Interviews, of course, are conducted of individuals, but in the course of the research, also consider adding people in key institutions or people who might bear something on the lives of the people you're studying, especially if your study participants have mentioned a particular institution as key for their lives. Excuse me. So this is how, for instance, I ended up interviewing priests and pastors. It was the study participants who mentioned them in the interviews that then led me to them. And of course, very importantly, access to study participants to a particular site is done through trusted spaces, trusted individuals, key people in those spaces, where who will give you access to what eventually will be your study participants. I am going to stop here because we are going. I think that's my time. Thank you so much, and now I can take questions, comments.
Cecilia, you actually have another half hour if you have other things you want to say.
I thought it was 40 minutes and then.
No. If you have.
Oh my goodness. So maybe people can start asking me questions to okay. I was just actually timing myself very closely.
Oh, well, you did a great job. So, all right. What questions do we have? Why don't you just?
I can see them now.
Oh, okay, great.
Okay.
So
let's see.
Claudia Solari, can you see her question?
Yes. Have you had an experience where someone terminates an interview? How does it impact your study in future participants? Let me see. Has someone stopped an interview? So let me see. They stop the interview, but mostly because the context around the interview changes. Someone comes in, something changes, and we have to stop it and then continue at a later time. By the time I get to interview people, I have already, remember, quite a bit of the interviews that I've done have been done in the context of ethnographic fieldwork. So in my case, by the time I get to the interview, I have already met people informally. But we had a couple of people who did not want to be, that's another thing that I didn't mention, recording an interview. We've had here in Phoenix, actually, 2 people did not want to be recorded. So we had to take extensive notes during the interview. And that was, you always give people the opportunity to give you permission for recording or not.
Okay. So there's another question. I don't know if you can see it, from Savannah Carson.
Yes. When you have a more standardized set of questions or need to move on to the next topic, which may not be relevant for your work, what are your favorite ways? Yes, ways to transition. Those are actually not so easy sometimes, I have to tell you, because you get into a topic and the person is telling you all these very important things, but you also know that you need to move on to a different topic. You don't want to cut them off because that affects the rest of the interview. Of course, they're going to start giving you yes and no answers because they may think that you're rushed. So it's you have to see how things are going, how you can really change the topic in a way that is not going to seem dismissive or that it's not that you're not interested. So changing the topic um, can be sometimes a little more challenging, but sometimes it's not, because what I have done in interviews all the time, even if I know the script of the interview, I always have a printed copy of the interview and I have it in front of me. And this serves as a reminder that we are in a context, in a research context here. It's not just an informal conversation about your life. So one way that I have that makes it easier to change topics is just a very quick look down on the interview script, and the person realizes that you're doing your job. This is part of your work. So just a quick look down, and you can change topics.
So Natalia says, can you provide examples of the types of questions you would ask when probing for information about people's social networks?
Mhm. So, for instance, when I asked, did you did you contact your mother or your mother-in-law? Did, did your mother-in-law um, provide you with a small loan or something like that? And the person would say, no, 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 no. We would never go to her because she's of no help. Um, the next question would be, how is that? Has this happened in other situations? Is this a one-time thing? Have you experienced this with her before? And so that leads to more examples and more probing along those lines. So the what happened next, what did you do? How did you feel? How did you respond? Those examples that I gave earlier are useful for further probing and maintaining the line of the conversation at the same time.
Okay, so Fadila asks, I want to learn more about the number of participants that we need to interview. Some scholars say between 10 and 15. Does the number depend on the research question, the nature of the study, ethnographic, for instance? Do you have a specific reference we can consult and cite in the methods section? I think you talked about the number before, but you may want to address
Yes.
this question.
If you're only doing in-depth interviews, I would go for a little bit more. Well, it depends on what you want these in-depth interviews for. I would go with the higher number if you're only doing in-depth interviews. But if you are complementing with observations and informal conversations, then you could go with fewer. For instance, in the study in Kansas right now, it's an ongoing ethnography. It's been going on for 3 years. We have formally interviewed far fewer people than you would imagine, because we counted last about 2,900 pages, single space field notes. So the formal interviews actually are the opposite. They complement the ethnographic field research. But if you are only doing, if in-depth interviews is your primary form of data collection, and you're supplementing that with some observations, then I would recommend a few more interviews, maybe to get to that, to the maybe 40, 50, because you also want some variation within the group of study participants, because you want to know, for instance, if people of different genders experience whatever you're studying in the same way. And you can't really do that if you only have one or two interviews in each of these different categories into which you place people for analysis. Depending on how you're using in-depth interviews, you want to either increase that number in order to reach that variation and saturation at the same time, or if you're using in-depth interviews to complement another method, or if you're using in-depth interviews to complement, for instance, survey research. That's another way to not necessarily do as many in-depth interviews. And that would be fine, 10, 15, 20 interviews to perhaps go more in depth in a particular area of the survey that you're doing. That would be fine too, if it's complementary to something else.
Great. Let me ask a question.
Yes.
So, as you were talking, you're talking about essentially how you do in-depth interviews in the field, but then, of course, there's a big step after that, right? Which is how you then take everything that you've learned and I would say analyze it, but distill it or think through it. How do you think about, I don't mean in detail, but can you give us sort of what the next steps would be, or how many of the steps you're doing during field work and then after? How do you think about that?
Yes, and this is where the ethnographic field work goes in one direction, and the in-depth interviews goes in a slightly different direction. Right. With in-depth interviews, of course, you start the process of coding. There are, and I didn't cover analysis here today, but there are very good, very good textbooks on how to code using software, but also not using software, so you understand really the logic of coding. Coding broadly to begin with. Coding, for instance, everything that deals with work, paid work. That's one category, but within that, you have more specific coding. And you do that with any of the other areas on which you want to focus, or family, or any topic that you're interested in coding. You can do that, of course, with several software programs that allow you to code quite easily also. Both follow the same intuitive logic to see what people. I have also, because I still code by hand quite a bit, although now with my research in Kansas, we're using software. But for instance, I have taken one transcript. Oh, that's another thing. Everything has to be transcribed. I have taken one transcript and just look for terms that came up in the previous interview. I want to see if it has come up in the next interview, to see if that's a line that I want to follow, or if it was just a fluke and just two people mentioned that. You can do that, of course, with software. But it's also good to do it just following your own thinking and what you want to sort of ask from the data.
Dr. Menhivar, if I could, I wrote a question in the chat about software, which you just mentioned. And I know I've taken classes, mixed methods courses, and also qualitative courses where we do both coding without any software, but also with software. Is there any particular software that you recommend? I know I've worked with Deduce in the past, but in your experience?
That's what we're using right now for the work in Kansas. Deduce is what we're using. I still like to have the transcripts and look for whatever comes up. For instance, lately it's been a lot of detention related topics. So I want to see what the transcript, and also we have the field work, field notes. But Deduce is what is what seems to be easier to use, not too complicated, and seems fine. It's similar to what we would do without software, I think. Is that what you find, Esmeralda?
From my experience, I would agree with you. But at the same time, I haven't tried other software, but in terms of using Deduce, it is user-friendly.
Oh, earlier I tried using one of the early programs, in Vivo, and it took a long time to code one interview. Well, it takes time to code interviews anyway, because of the different trees you develop with when you follow when you use a software program. But and I'm going by what my former graduate student has recommended, and she says that of the programs that she has tried, Deduce seems to be the one that she recommended for us.
Have you ever used Atlas?
No, I haven't.
Okay.
That it's mostly because I'm going by what my co-author Andrea has tested, and she finds this one to be sort of intuitive.
One more question from me. So for people
Yes.
who have no idea what you mean by coding, I mean, so some people think of coding as sitting down writing computer code. So for people who have no idea what you mean by coding, can you talk a little bit about what it is? Do you start with a preset idea of topics? What do you, I mean, and then what do you do? Just, can you say a little bit?
Yes. Yes, we have to start with, the topics that we want to cover in the interview. So we start with, for instance, what people have said, and that of course is very much based on what I'm interested in. So we start with what people say about their families and who is in the family, who are close, who are not. So those are what are called general, broad, open coding. So you either color code, but the software allows you to do the big categories and the smaller ones. So the big categories are the large, very large topics. Church, anything that relates to church can be color coded in green. Employment in another color. Then once you have done all that, you go through with more specific codes within those larger categories. So you go to under employment, maybe once you read the transcripts, you come across the type of employment they have, the type of job they do. So people work as caretakers or work in as store clerks. And so if that's what you're interested in, you code for that. So it depends on what you're interested in, because the same interview can generate data for different questions that you have. If religion is what you're interested in, then you want the broad category of religion to refine that into what kind of what church they attend. Do they meet people in their churches? Do they have friends at church? And so those become categories within the broader category. These branches of a tree, of a branch of a tree. Did I make?
Yeah, that's very helpful. That's very helpful. So what other questions do we have?
Let's see. The do spot was created by a UCLA professor.
So one of the questions from May Sudhinarasat is, can you discuss your process for determining integrator reliability?
You know,
are you doing all the coding yourself, or do you have multiple people doing the coding?
Only this time, only with my former graduate student, who's my colleague. So she actually is doing most of the coding, I have to say. She has been doing that since she was a graduate student. So she's been doing all of it, and she consults with me when she finds something that I think needs attention. She's been doing that. So we've been working on this really together. In another project that I did not mention because it does not involve in-depth interviewing, we had an undergraduate student and a graduate student coding newspaper articles. And for that, it's a different story because it's analysis of text. Analysis of text is one thing, and analysis of transcripts, interview transcripts is different. But I have, and in the past, I've done my own coding. In fact, when I started doing this, I used to do it all by hand, using different color pencils to do this. But I've never had a team of people coding. I've done it myself or one graduate student with whom I work very closely.
May, do you have any follow-up question, or I guess not?
No, that's really helpful. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm kind of in the process of doing some EMIC and EDIC coding right now, and so just going through the process of trying to calculate IRR across different folks who are coding across countries with different cultural understandings potentially of the data, and so but that's really useful. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, what else?
What else would like to know about in-depth interviews?
I have a follow-up question, Dr. Menhivar, in regards to, first of all, deciding to use in-depth interviews as opposed to focus groups. And I know both of them have pros and cons or some limitations, but in which instances from your experience and the work that you've been doing, have you decided to do in-depth interviews, perhaps maybe starting with a focus group and then after doing the focus groups, deciding that you want to do a few in-depth interviews, or the other way around?
I have not. I am very familiar with focus groups. I have read about focus groups. I have read research based on focus groups, but I have not used focus groups myself. because I think it's mostly because the what I investigate doesn't really lend itself sometimes. Maybe if I were to do a focus group at a church and to ask people's experiences of maybe immigration enforcement. But I have not used focus groups because quite a bit of what people disclose during an interview, sometimes it's a personal aspect of their story, who they may not want to share that in the presence of others. So so of course not all topics are going to lend themselves to in-depth interviews, but also to the context of a focus group. A focus group, I think, can be very useful excuse me, when the different study participants excuse me, will not be influenced necessarily by what others may think. So what they disclose, it may not be, they are all sort of in the same, either they don't know each other at all, or they have something in common, where they are not going to mind that others listen to what they have to say. So I think that's what I have seen about focus groups, but I have not used focus groups in my work. I've only used individual and really individual interviews. Even if I interview several members of the same family, it's always in my case, it's in individual interviews.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Okay, anything else? Other burning questions?
Oh, there's
Okay. There is one more. Purnima, you want to ask your question?
Sure. Hi, I was just curious about, how you would go about reconciling differences within coding and interpreting the data when you have multiple people working on the project, um, and also any best practices or methods that you would recommend.
Well, I think what Dr. Menhivar just said was she normally doesn't have multiple people working on the project. So
yeah, it's just at most 2 people, but that's very when the project I had in Phoenix, I had graduate students help me collect the data, but not to code or analyze. I only did that with one student who was interested maybe in publishing something with me later, but not the 4 or 5 graduate students who helped me do the interviews. In Kansas, for that project, I had 2 graduate students to begin with. But that was in the initial parts of the project, when we were the first year of the project. I call that the initial part of the project, but not during the coding or analyzing part of the project. So I really have not had teams of people analyzing interviews.
Purnima, you want to follow up?
Yeah, actually, I the thing is, because I worked in a team of 2 and we still had these differences, like, and one of our classes with Dr. Gibson, we were coding the same transcript together to make sure that we were kind of interpreting the concepts and themes the same way. And I found that on one of my projects, it was difficult to kind of interpret the same things, and ultimately we came up with a way of discussing each time we differed, and then we would just document and annotate it and move forward. but it was hard to do that.
With these projects, was this one project that started out with both of you working together from the very beginning, but then you had different interpretations of the same thing? I can't hear you.
Seems like yes. I think the answer is
Oh,
yes.
yes. So initially when we started, we kind of coded the same transcript, like about 5 or 6 of them together, and we had a framework that we were kind of working off of. So we jointly read the same transcript and talked about what code we would apply, and there were differences then, and then we resolved it like by explaining why we were doing what we were doing, and then and that's how we kind of kept it up from there onwards.
Yeah, I am. Let's see. Have I had any disagreements? No, we don't always agree on everything. With even with my long time collaborator, my Andrea. But we look into why that may be the case, further into field notes or further into a transcript, and then we can find, kind of reconcile the difference. Sometimes I think, for instance, I see something that surprises me, but then she says, well, no, that's actually not the case. This is the case because this is what happened next. So, so yeah, no, of course, we don't always see the same thing, but for us, this is where additional context helps to reconcile the discrepancy.
And I should say, for anybody interested in this question, several people have weighed in on the chat with their own experiences. So have a look at that.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Any other questions?
Yeah. Oh my goodness.
We can let people.
There's a lot of stuff in the chat that I had not realized.
We can save the chat if you want to read it.
Oh yeah, that would be great.
Okay. Esmeralda, do you have a way to save the chat?
Yes, I can do that.
Oh yeah, that would be great, because I hadn't had a chance to read all of them.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yes, and I'm sorry I misunderstood, because I was trying to be as concise and.
No. This is our fault. I mean,
by 45 minutes, I thought
we go 90 minutes, and we should have emphasized it more. But you were great. Okay. So I want to say thank you so much. We really, really appreciate you coming and talking to us. And good luck with all the things that you are in the middle of doing. And stay safe and healthy. And that goes for everybody else too.
Yes, thank you so much for the invitation, for the opportunity. This has been wonderful, and I look forward to reading the comments on the chat that Esmeralda, who's been wonderful too in organizing everything. So I want to thank everyone, and all the questions, comments, to Dr. Pebley, of course, and Esmeralda has been great, and so thank you so much. Stay healthy and well, everybody. Be very careful out there.
Thank you, Dr. Menhivar. Thank you, Dr. Pebley.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Bye.